Nonviolently Resisting Tyranny by Sanderson Beck. Modern history has many examples of people resisting imperial domination by using more or less nonviolent methods. Between 1567 and 1579, Dutch Protestants revolted against the Catholic Spanish imperialism of Philip II and established a republic governed by States General. American colonists nonviolently refused to cooperate with the British Stamp Act of 1765 until it was repealed. Another tax imposed without representation was resisted by the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when merchants dressed as Mohawks threw imported tea into the harbor. John Adams later wrote that the real American Revolution was nonviolent and had occurred between 1760 and 1775, when the colonists had essentially become independent. This was followed by a war between the newly independent republic and British imperialism. Hungarians resisted domination by Austria, but the violent revolt led by Kossuth was a failure. While the reformer Ferenc Deák got Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph to recognize rights of the Hungarians in the Compromise of 1867 that made the empire Austro-Hungarian. The best revolutions are nonviolent. On January 9, 1905, thousands of Russians marched peacefully to the Winter Palace of Tsar Nicholas II, but guards mowed down demonstrators with machine guns. Russian sailors on the cruiser Potemkin mutinied in July at Odessa, and in October a general strike was called. On October 17th, Nicholas granted a constitution with a parliament, Duma, and civil liberties, but later he withdrew his concessions and repressed dissent. The 1917 revolution began with marches celebrating International Women's Day on March 8th, February 23rd in the old Julian calendar. After 2 days of strikes and riots, the Russian troops fighting in the Great War mutinied, and on March 15th, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. In July, Minister of War Kerensky headed a provisional government. Housewives who had to wait in long bread lines began demonstrating. And on November 6th, old October 24th, V.I. Lenin ordered the signal that sent soldiers, sailors, and factory workers rushing into government offices and the Winter Palace. Kerensky accepted Bolshevik support to prevent General Kornilov from being dictator, and Bolsheviks led by Leon Trotsky gained a majority of the Petrograd Soviet. But the next day, Kerensky fled, and Lenin took control as the Council of People's Commissars, with Leon Trotsky as Commissar for Foreign Affairs and Stalin as Commissar for National Minorities. The first reform the Soviets made was to abolish capital punishment. Peasants began seizing fields of the landlords. Lenin kept his promise by withdrawing the Russian army from the war, but they were soon attacked by their former Western allies. This is not the place to tell the sad story of how this revolution degenerated into a totalitarian empire, especially after Stalin took power. After Germany lost the Great War on March 10, 1920, the right-wing Wolfgang Kapp and top army officers seized the government in Berlin. But the Weimar Republic used nonviolent methods to survive this coup, putsch. The Ebert government fled Berlin but told people not to cooperate with the new regime. When officers occupied newspaper offices, the Berlin printers went on strike, followed by other workers. A general strike was declared by the Ebert cabinet and the executives of the Social Democratic Party, SDP. The Kappist regime had no money and could not make the bureaucrats cooperate. The Ebert government refused to compromise with the Kappists. An airplane dropped leaflets announcing the collapse of the military dictatorship. Even threats to shoot people and the shooting of some failed to stop the strike. On March 17th, the Berlin security police demanded that Kapp resign, and later that day he did resign and fled to Sweden. General Lutwitz remained as commander-in-chief, but he resigned that night. The next day, the Baltic brigades marched out of Berlin, shooting some civilians who jeered at them. The Ebert government resumed its functions, but still faced some chaos in the country. The Versailles Treaty had forced Germany to give up the coal-mining Ruhr region to French and Belgian control. In 1923, Germans resented severe French repression and increased their non-cooperation and acts of sabotage. The French realized that they were losing more than they were gaining. They agreed to withdraw French troops, and the Germans ended the passive resistance campaign. During World War II, as Nazi Germany took over countries in Europe, nonviolent resistance gradually developed, especially in Norway and Denmark. The Nordic countries had declared neutrality, but the German invasion in the spring of 1940 defeated the Norwegian Defense Forces as the cabinet fled to London. Pressure groups tried to influence political decisions under the German occupation. In September, all Norwegian political parties were dissolved, and the parliament was disbanded as German commissioners took control. Radios were confiscated, but a few remained or were built to hear the British Broadcasting Company, BBC, news. Norwegian teachers were threatened with dismissal if they did not follow the policies of the new government. But instead of signing on to that, teachers signed a counter-declaration saying they would teach according to their own consciences. They refused to teach Nazi propaganda in the schools or cooperate with a Nazi youth organization. In February 1942, the Germans set up the Norwegian Vidkun Quisling as minister-president, but controlled all his decisions. He proclaimed a law creating the Norwegian Teachers' Union. Teachers and parents sent in letters of protest. In March, more than 1,000 teachers were arrested and sent to concentration camps. In April, Quisling allowed the teachers to teach even though they still refused to indoctrinate. Church leaders also criticized the violence of the German occupation and refused to reveal the secrets of the confessional. A pastoral letter was printed and distributed, though the Germans confiscated half of the 50,000 printed. On Easter in 1942, the clergy renounced their state-paid salaries, but continued to perform their spiritual duties. Denmark had also declared neutrality and offered little armed resistance as the Germans invaded their country on April 9, 1940. The Danish government remained in place, although they had to make some concessions to the Germans. They rejected a common currency and customs with Germany and refused to let the Danish Nazis take power. The resistance developed gradually but increased in violence when the Germans were losing the war. The Danes, especially the students, began to wear red, white, and blue caps, and more Danes began giving the German occupiers the cold shoulder. The BBC broadcasted to Danes in Danish. Sabotage attacks dramatically increased in 1942 to more than 100, and in 1943 there were more than 1,000. In August 1943, spontaneous strikes and demonstrations spread. Germans gave the Danish government an ultimatum, which Erik Scavenius refused. The Germans took over the government, but that month the British recognized the Danes' Freedom Council that was trying to coordinate the resistance and would not allow army officers to participate until 1944. In October 1943, Berlin ordered all the 7,000 Jews in Denmark arrested, but the Danes managed to help all but 500 to escape to Sweden. During the occupation, 538 illegal newspapers circulated, reaching 10 million people in 1944. They effectively counteracted German propaganda. Rebelling against Soviet domination. The Soviet Union used their share of the military victory in World War II to expand their communist empire into Eastern Europe. This turned into a conflict with the Western capitalist nations that became known as the Cold War. The United States already had atomic weapons. When the Soviet Union developed them in 1949 and the hydrogen bomb in 1953, these rival nations became known as superpowers. Yet, despite the lack of free elections and civil liberties in communist nations dominated by the Soviet Union, nonviolent resistance began to develop in certain places. After Stalin died in March 1953, 250,000 political prisoners at Vorkuta in the Soviet Union were informed that they should not expect amnesty. So they went on strike and were encouraged when the hated head of the secret police, Beria, fell. But strike leaders were removed and some were shot. After 3 months, lack of food and fuel forced the strikers to go back to work, but they had gained some concessions. East German workers proclaimed a more liberal course on June 11, 1953, and refused to accept an increase in hours without an increase in pay. Workers marched in Berlin and called for a general strike. About 300,000 workers were on strike in 272 towns by June 17th. The demonstrations the day before had been peaceful, but on this day posters and newspaper kiosks were smashed and burned, and scuffling began with the police. Some prisons were stormed and more than just political prisoners escaped. Crowds even beat to death a few officials and informers. At 1 p.m., the strike committee met and decided to tell workers to go back into the firms but stay on strike. 2 hours later, a state of emergency was declared, and Soviet tanks rolled in with machine guns to quell the uprising, killing 569 and wounding 1,744. The Red Army took up strategic positions along the border with West Berlin at post offices, railway stations, and docks. They were ordered to act with restraint, and in the entire country only 21 more people were killed. Later, News Deutschland portrayed the episode as fascism shows its ugly face. Not wanting to start another world war, U.S. President Eisenhower limited his response to sending food aid to the East Germans. In Poland, Cardinal Wyszynski was arrested in 1953 and held in prison. In 1955, the Soviet Empire formed the Warsaw Pact to counter the Western North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, that had been formed in 1949. When Nikita Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1956, he criticized Stalin and exposed his cruel policies. In June, striking workers in Poland gained some concessions, although 70 workers were killed in clashes with the Polish army and police. Stalin had imposed the leader Rákosi on Hungary, and he was forced to resign in July 1956 as a gesture to the Hungarian people. Khrushchev visited Warsaw on October 19th, and 2 days later the Central Committee elected Gomulka first secretary of the Polish Communist Party. The next day, demonstrations occurred in Budapest to support the Poles. After a poor harvest and fuel shortages, Hungarian students and workers began demonstrating in the streets for their 16 points, demanding personal freedom, more food, and removal of secret police and Russian domination. Imre Nagy was named prime minister, and János Kádár became foreign minister. The Red Army withdrew, and Nagy announced he was allowing political parties. In Poland, Gomulka released Cardinal Wyszynski from prison. When Nagy broadcast on October 31st that Hungary was going to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, Kádár left and formed a government in eastern Hungary supported by Soviet tanks. 4 days later, Soviet tanks entered Budapest and brutally killed even the wounded, dragging around their bodies with tanks to scare away others. An estimated 30,000 people were killed, and approximately 200,000 fled to the west without their belongings. Nagy was tried and executed as Kádár took control. These dramatic events coincided with the Suez Crisis. On January 5, 1968, Alexander Dubček became first secretary of the Czech Communist Party. His liberal policy ended censorship. But in Warsaw, on January 30th, a play portraying Poland suffering under Russian imperialism in the 19th century was shut down, and student leader Adam Michnik was arrested. On March 8th, Polish students began protesting these and shouting that Poland is waiting for a Dubček. 3 days later, the police and workers' militia were brought in to quell the students in a battle that lasted 8 hours. On March 14th, students in Krakow began a sympathy strike, and student protests spread throughout Poland. Gomułka blamed Zionists, and Moczar began anti-Semitic purges, causing 2/3 of the 30,000 Polish Jews who had survived the Holocaust to leave the country. After Kolakowski and 5 other Jewish professors were dismissed from the University of Warsaw, students demanded that Kolakowski be reinstated. 1,300 students were expelled. That spring, major student demonstrations erupted in Paris. On August 20th, 1968, the Soviet Union, with its Warsaw allies, invaded Czechoslovakia with 500,000 troops and abducted Dubček, Prime Minister Černík, National Assembly President Smerkovsky, and National Front Chairman Kriegel. The popular Czech President Ludvík Svoboda was put under house arrest, but he refused to sign a document for the conservative regime. Czech officials issued emergency orders for all troops to stay in their barracks. The Czech news agency refused to broadcast an announcement that party and government officials had requested Soviet help. The extraordinary 14th Party Congress, the National Assembly, and remaining government ministers announced that the invasion had begun without their knowledge or consent. The National Assembly also demanded the release of their constitutional representatives and the immediate withdrawal of the Warsaw Pact forces. They called for 1-hour general strikes and asked rail workers to slow the trains bringing equipment to jam radio broadcasts. The Czech police refused to collaborate with the invaders. Radio broadcasts warned that violence was futile and advised nonviolent resistance. Students were asked to calm explosive situations. The Soviet Empire had militarily occupied Czechoslovakia, but they still faced a political challenge. Svoboda was flown to Moscow but refused to negotiate without Dubček, Černík, and Smerkovsky. They agreed on a compromise that retained them in their positions, but that gave the party a more leading role and left Russian troops in the country. Many Czechs resented the loss of reforms and would not accept it for a week. Apparently, the leaders did not think the people would continue their resistance. The next April, Dubček was replaced as party leader by Gustav Husak. The lessons of Prague 1968 would not be forgotten. On December 14, 1970, workers from the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk went on strike, but the Polish students who felt they had been betrayed by the workers in 1968 refused to join them. The next day was called Bloody Tuesday as fighting broke out all over Gdansk, and the following day there were terrible tank and helicopter battles. The strike spread to Gdynia and Szczecin, and the battles shifted there on December 17th. 3 days later, Gomułka resigned and was replaced by Edvard Gierek, and the Christmas season ended the battles. The official report counted 45 dead and 1,165 wounded, but other estimates were much higher. On January 22, 1971, workers went on strike because of a speed-up and demanded to meet with Gierek, who talked with them for 9 hours and said he was a worker too. The workers decided to give him a chance, and he developed a revised 5-year plan that expanded the consumer sector. On June 24, 1976, an official announcement that food prices would be raised up to 60% caused sit-down strikes throughout Poland. The price increases were canceled and the strikes ended, but many labor leaders had been arrested. In September, Kuron, Michnik, and other intellectuals formed the Workers' Defense Committee, KOR, to give workers legal advice and inform the public. An underground press spread ideas. Michnik wrote how the bond between force and deception kept people from establishing honest relations with each other as they used deceit for self-preservation in the totalitarian system. The KOR broke through this isolation, and they were wise enough to reject violence and revenge. Now people could gather and look each other in the eye. Michnik gave many writers credit for sacrificing material comforts to do their writing, even though it could only be published unofficially on a small scale as samizdat, self-published. On October 16, 1978, Archbishop Karol Wojtyla of Krakow was elected Pope John Paul II. His visit to Poland in June 1979 was an inspiration to many. In September, KOR's journal published a Charter of Workers' Rights. In December, Lech Walesa and Andrzej Guzasta organized a memorial service for the 1970 martyrs, and many people were arrested. Walesa warned that if a memorial was not built, in 1 year, 35 million Poles would each bring a brick to build it themselves. In July 1980, the government nearly doubled meat prices, causing strikes around Poland. Warsaw strikers immediately gained pay increases of 10% or more, and the strikes spread. On August 14th, the dismissed electrician Lech Walesa climbed into the Lenin shipyard at Gdansk and began a sit-down strike over the illegal dismissal of a worker, as 16,000 workers demanded an independent union. The sit-ins spread, and an inter-factory strike committee was formed. On August 20th, Kuran and Michnik were arrested along with 12 other KOR activists. Strike leaders demanded communication lines be restored before continuing talks with the government, and they posted their 21 demands. By the end of August, the government had agreed to allow free trade unions, free information in media, and civil rights. The new unions adopted the name Solidarity, and soon had more than 10 million members. Suddenly, a closed society was allowed to exchange information openly, and the effect was euphoric. However, the economy was a mess with a huge foreign debt, and the media was still mostly controlled. A polluted environment and malnutrition caused diseases the healthcare system could not handle. The Polish Communist Party lost hundreds of thousands of members. In September 1981, Walesa was elected president of Solidarity, but wanted it to stay a trade union and not become a political movement. Yet many wanted political reforms. In November, Solidarity insisted on discussing major reforms with the Communist Party, and student strikes spread. In December, Walesa warned that they could not remain passive any longer. The loyal communist, General Wojciech Jaruzelski, had been made prime minister in February 1981, and on December 13th he declared a state of war and ordered thousands arrested as tanks patrolled the streets. Strikes were crushed one after another. The Solidarity Union was officially dissolved in October 1982, and the next month Walesa was released but kept under surveillance. In December, the state of war was suspended. Walesa was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, but declined to leave Poland lest he not be allowed to return. Martial law was formally lifted in July 1983, but more restrictive laws had been instituted. The economy continued in stagnation. 33 university presidents were removed by authorities in 1985, but the next year they released 20,000 out of 114,000, freeing 225 political prisoners, including Michnik. In June 1987, Pope John Paul II made his third pilgrimage to Poland and proclaimed that solidarity had eternal significance.